Hello YouTube. Phobos, meaning fear in Greek, is the larger of the two tiny moons of Mars. It very well may be the most mysterious celestial body in our solar system. Let's start from the beginning. Iosif Samuilovich Shklovsky, a Soviet scientist and a famous astrophysicist, once co-authored a book with Carl Sagan, a book titled Intelligent Life in the Universe. Around 1958, Shklovsky, studying the secular acceleration of Phobos' orbital motion, suggested a thin sheet metal structure for Phobos, a suggestion which led to speculation that Phobos was of artificial origin. In 1959, Shklovsky expressed an opinion that Phobos was of artificial origin and quite hollow inside. Shklovsky based his analysis on estimates of the upper Martian atmosphere's density and deduced that for the weak braking effect to be able to account for this secular acceleration, Phobos had to be very light. One calculation yielded a hollow iron sphere 16 kilometers across, but less than 6 centimeters thick. He tried to explain the incredible rotation speed that the moonlet has in relation to the orbit of Mars. Now, Russian astronomer and mathematician Dr. Hermann Struve spent months to calculate orbits of Martian satellites with great precision. That took place in the beginning of the 20th century. His observations of the moon of Mars, Phobos, were later used by Western scientists in studying the secular acceleration of its orbit. Shklovsky studied Struve's report and eventually concluded that the orbital velocity and position of Phobos in space do not correspond to Struve's mathematical predictions. After studying for an extended period of time gravitational and magnetic forces, Shklovsky was convinced that there are no natural explanations for the creation of Martian two moons. No explanation for their strange behavior, as is fully demonstrated by Phobos. Phobos is a moonlet of Mars. The two Martian moons, Phobos and Deimos, orbit Mars nearly in the plane of its equator. Phobos goes around once every 7.7 hours, and Deimos goes around every 30.2 hours. Mars itself rotates on its axis once every 24.6 hours. Phobos rotates around its orbit much faster. Planet Mars has the highest orbital eccentricity of any planet in our solar system except Pluto. A football-shaped object, Phobos is one of the smallest moons in the solar system. For example, it's so tiny that it would fit definitely inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway. The little moon completes an orbit in just 7 hours precisely and 39 minutes, which is faster than Mars rotates. Rising in the Martian west, it runs 3 laps around Red Planet in the course of one Martian day. It is the only satellite, whatever its origin happens to be, in the solar system that circle its planet in a time shorter than the parent planet's day. Slightly egg-shaped, Phobos is 27 kilometers in diameter from end to end. As to its origin, most scientists have 2 theories. One theory holds that the oblong moon is an asteroid captured by the gravitational pull of Mars. Another says it is leftover matter from the red planet's creation event. Now, whereas some believe that these moons are captured asteroids, others have argued that Phobos and Deimos were created when fragments ejected from Mars due to giant impacts on the surface. It orbits Mars at a mean distance of 9,000 kilometers. Its major known feature is a large crater named Stickney, which is 10 kilometers wide. Phobos was discovered along with its smaller companion Deimos by Asaph Hall at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. in August 1877. Stickney, by the way, is the maiden name of Asaph Hall's wife. The moons are named after the children of the Greek god Ares, who, like the Roman Mars, is the god of war. Demon means terror or panic, and Phobos means fear. Phobos has an equatorial orbit, which is almost circular. It is expected to crash into Mars or break up and leave a ring of fragments around the planet within 100 million years. But let's worry about things that are happening right now. Phobos is too light for gravity to make it spherical. It has a very lumpy appearance and is heavily cratered. Observations by the Mars Global Surveyor reveal that the surface is covered in dust at least 1 meter thick, suggesting erosion due to meteor bombardment. According to some scientists, numerous secondary craters were probably formed as the result of the impact which created Stickney, which means crater count is an accurate chronometer for Phobos. Radiating from Stickney are large grooves, which may indicate the force of the impact. However, other grooves on the central portion of the moon run almost parallel, and it is suggested that they may have been created by ejection from impact on the Martian surface below. But believe me, there are other suggestions as to the nature of the grooves. It is very probable that the famous British writer Jonathan Swift knew about the tiny moons and described them in his literary work, and that would make it, of course, earlier than their official discovery in 1877. Swift wrote about the moons of Mars in Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726, and he knew that there were 2 moons and described their size and orbital period very close to the real numbers. The writer referred to 2 moons in Part 3, Chapter 3, The Voyage to Laputa, in which Laputa's astronomers are described as having discovered 2 satellites of Mars orbiting at distances of 3 and 5 Martian diameters, with periods of 10 and 20.5 hours. In the 20th century, Vladimir Gennadievich Perminov, a spacecraft designer of early Soviet Mars and Venus spacecraft, speculated that Swift found and deciphered records that Martians left on Earth. Vladimir Perminov was the leading designer for Mars and Venus spacecraft at the Lavochkin Design Bureau in the Soviet Union during the early days of Mars exploration. He recounted the hectic days and urgent atmosphere in the communist bureaucracy to design and successfully launch a Mars orbiter, a Mars lander, and a Mars rover. The goal was to beat the United States to Mars. In my earlier video, I also presented information about a very strange map that made its way to Armenia in antiquity, a map of Martian surface. Moreover, a circumference with a small circle depicted in it was drawn around Mars. Obviously, this was a satellite of the planet. The information contained in the single sheet showing the map was very scarce. The text was in Latin, but apparently it was a translation from an ancient Egyptian text. There was no information whatsoever about the age the map was made and who made it. The Martian moonlets Deimos and Phobos were officially discovered, as we know, in 1877. Now, the map discovered by the officer of the Stalin secret police, who took it with him, That map clearly showed only one moonlet. Now, to reiterate, Iosif Shklovsky reached a conclusion in the 20th century that Phobos has to be hollow inside. And now let's see what's going on when terrestrial powers are trying to reach the small moon of Mars. Those involved in the Soviet space program, as well as their Western colleagues, had been very much interested in Phobos. On July 12, 1988, the Soviets launched two unmanned probes, Phobos 1 and Phobos 2, in the direction of Mars. The probes were actually a joint creation of Western scientists and their Soviet counterparts. It is an important point to remember for anyone doing research of the space probes sent to Mars. The project had an international participation from its very inception. In the early 1990s, I and a recently retired American scientist involved in the Russian UFO research, as well as aircraft cases around the globe, together we obtained very interesting open source Soviet task publications about the Phobos probes. The Soviet Izvestia newspaper on March 3, 1989, in an article written by Leskov, reported that data from the probes was transmitted to the European Mission Center, to France, and to NASA. Nothing was done by Soviets without the input and recommendations of their colleagues. It looks that the JPL in Pasadena was directly involved. Also, Leskov was amazed at the level of mutual participation. Just as equally amazed was I after reviewing task documents regarding the failed Phobos mission. Whatever Phobos the moonlet contained was of utmost importance to all. The Americans eagerly transferred all their Phobos astrometrical observations to Soviets. American radio telescopes stationed throughout our planet were to help the Soviets, according to the March 11, 1989 Учительская газета newspaper, quoting Kolesnikov from the Flight Control Center. The Swiss and the French provided a special measuring device they created jointly with the Soviets. Remember all this information when you hear about modern attempts to reach Mars and its moons. Despite all the Cold War rhetoric or any differences in today's world, despite all the sensationalism and screaming of the newspapers, in the background, the governments work together to reach Mars and its moons. Now, back to the 1980s. Each probe contained a complicated set of devices: 3 television cameras, spectrometer, guidance system, and a video recording system. Also, Phobos 2 probe contained a strange laser device called LIMA-D or LIMA-D. Specialists in the Leningrad Institute of Precision Mechanics, together with Eastern European and Finnish scientists, created this curious machine. The device was to emit a laser ray at the surface of the moonlet, to cause a mini explosion and gather data on evaporated substance. Apparently, this was the most important experiment that the probe was to conduct, according to Lamanov, a reporter, as published in the Социалистическая Индустрия newspaper, March 26, 1989, one day before the accident. By the way, the technical name for Phobos 2 was Video Spectrometrический Комплекс, VSK, and its personal name was Fregat. Now let's talk about the disaster, or the accident, or call it whatever you want. Call it abduction. Phobos 1 spacecraft was lost in September of 1988 on its way to Mars. The Soviets claimed a radio command error. Phobos 2 was also lost, but before it did, images and information were sent to Earth. The probe arrived at the Martian orbit in January of 1989. This was the beginning of the mission that included a transfer to an orbit that would make the probe fly in tandem with its namesake moonlet. Furthermore, Phobos was to be explored, and certain equipment had to be placed on the surface of the moon. The problems began when the probe aligned itself with the moonlet. On March 28, 1989, TASS, the official Soviet news agency, made an announcement that Phobos 2 failed to communicate with Earth as scheduled after completing an operation around the Martian moon Phobos. Scientists at the mission control have been unable to establish stable radio contact. In April of 1989, Lieutenant Colonel Baberdin published an article in Krasnaya Zvezda newspaper. In translation, the article said Enigmas of Martian Orbits. The date was April 4. The military commander mentioned that the unidentified spot on the Martian surface, photographed using the infrared wave range. The Soviet Vremya program mentioned it in its broadcast, and the military had to respond, albeit late. Baberdin states that the astrophysicists and planetologists carefully studied that image. Most likely this was a shadow from some space object. This shadow was able to sharply lower Martian atmosphere, and the onboard device of Phobos 2 was able to capture the image. But what the space object was remained unclear. In 1991, Marina Popovich, the famous Soviet aviator, author, and a UFO researcher, visited Los Angeles. I met with her, and she showed and gave to me a photograph that the Phobos 2 made before its demise, before its disappearance, before its end. It depicts a gigantic cylindrical object, approximately 25 kilometers long. After that last frame was radio transmitted back to Earth, the probe disappeared. Now, Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine had more interesting information in its April 10, 1989 issue to add to the whole story. A controller at the Kaliningrad Control Center reported that the limited signal received after conclusion of the Phobos 2 imaging session gave him an impression that he was tracking a spin-stabilized spacecraft, a spinner, as he said. Phobos 2 was in orbit around Mars on March 27, when it failed to re-establish communications with Earth. The probe was commanded to change its orientation for an imaging session. Its cameras had to be aimed at the moonlet, and later it was to resume its Earth-pointing orientation to downlink the data. But that never happened. Something struck the object and sent it into a spin. In the October 1989 issue of Nature, Soviet scientists published several technical reports regarding the few experiments that Phobos 2 actually conducted. Just one paragraph dealt with the loss of the space probe. However, that report did confirm that Phobos 2 was spinning, either because of a computer malfunction or because the space probe was impacted by an unknown object. The Globkosmos Agency was established in 1985 under the Ministry of General Machine Building as the Soviet Union's contract agency for space affairs by the government of Mikhail Gorbachev. Alexander Dunayev, who was appointed the first chairman of the Soviet Globkosmos Space Organization, talked to the reporter Liskov on March 29, 1989, after the probe's disappearance. This was reported in the Soviet Izvestia newspaper. According to Dunayev, a special commission was created the day before, right after the failure or disappearance, and it included the top space scientists. They came up with 7 reasons as to why the probe was lost. The commission was to issue a conclusion. Dunayev later reported that the loss of the probe was not a complete failure, because a range of scientific data was collected during the cruise phase, and the time Phobos 2 was in the Martian orbit. Images of the moonlet and Mars were being studied on Earth. One image, according to Dunayev, included an odd-shaped object between the spacecraft and Mars. He supposed it was either the debris in the orbit of Phobos or the Phobos 2 autonomous propulsion subsystem that was jettisoned after the spacecraft was injected into Mars orbit. However, Marina Popovich told me that the Globkosmos knew all along that whatever it was that destroyed the probe was created by artificial intelligence. Marina Popovich would be the one to know. She was in the upper circles of the Soviet space program. She wasn't a leader, but having been married to Pavel Popovich before, she knew many of the cosmonauts and the decision makers. She still is an outspoken person and very active in the UFO research program, especially years ago. And she participated in a number of very interesting events. But now let's get back to Phobos 2. There was another article published by Liskov in Izvestia on November 1st, 1990. Here's the information. Professor Ivanov, head of the ballistic service of the Flight Control Center, mentioned the rumors that JPL in Pasadena captured signals from the lost probe, contrary to all physical laws. Ivanov did not directly contradict the persistent rumors. He stated that by this time the lost probe would have ceased all communications and become frozen. The only other possibility, and not a serious one, he quickly added, would be that the Phobos 2 was dragged away by extraterrestrials, and they kept it functioning. Dr. Selivanov of the Globkosmos, who was also interviewed by Liskov, adds that he contacted the American scientists in Pasadena, but that they claimed that no signals from Phobos 2 was received. I am curious, where do the rumors come from? I mean, who would spread around those rumors about Phobos being still sending signals? And where would the information come from? I was trying to think, because at that time I was just as now very active in the UFO research field, and the information was coming from the Soviet Union, and I knew people who were doing UFO research in the United States. I don't remember any such rumors. I also admire the ease the Soviets and Americans handle direct communications about space probes. But there is another scientific opinion that is no less important than that of Ivanov's, of Selivanov's. And I'm speaking about the Soviet Professor Burdakov, which I mentioned in my other videos. And he was very much interested in what's going on. He made direct inquiries about the loss of Phobos 2 probe and discussed the matter with the original designers of the project, as well as those who had tested the spacecraft. Suspicious of official explanations, Professor Burdakov questioned the series of strange events that led to the destruction of Phobos 2. He knew nothing about the photo images taken by Phobos 2, and was unaware that certain individuals in the West discussed possible reasons why the probe perished. The professor came up with a hypothesis. If Mars is inhabited, the intelligent beings who exist there would not like the idea of a device placed on the surface of their moonlet for purposes of constant observation. Consequently, in his opinion, they did something about it. Burdakov's views were expressed in an article published in 1992 in the Russian magazine Quant. Vyacheslav Kovtunenko was the official head of the Phobos project. In his interview with correspondent Chernyshov of Krasny Voy newspaper on May 24, 1989, he reveals some details about the probes. The apparatuses were able to solve complex problems. Apparently, the designers found out about certain failures and design shortcomings during the flight, but were eager to proceed with the new expeditions. Now, Roald Sagdeyev, who moved to the United States some years after and could shed much light on Soviet space secrets, mentioned in the same interview that the work on the project was going well, except for the reluctance of financial organs in the West to help his Western partners complete the project. And yet, 13 countries had participated in the project. Why was such haste? And of course, why all the secrecy around the mission, which by now I cannot even call to be a Soviet mission? It was a joint creation of 13 countries. Now, Roald Kremnev of the Babakin Space Testing Center, another top scientist involved with the project, mentioned a swarm of small bodies around Phobos during the incident. What small bodies? What swarm? Did they cause the failure? Or, he added in his interview with Chernyshov, was the reason the alien body registered by the Phobos 2 on onboard device, was that the cause of the incident? Kremnev again talked to Leskov on April 14, the source is Izvestia newspaper, and stressed that the most discussed version of the failure is the gigantic object registered 3 days before the accident, and still there was no official conclusion. So now we know about a swarm of small bodies and the gigantic object. According to Leskov, Izvestia, April 16, 1989, who talked to top scientists involved in the project, the Soviets spent 272 million rubles for the project, and Western partners spent 51 million rubles. The probes cost 51 million rubles, an enormous amount of money for the time. It took 5 years, according to official information, to build the probes. What about the weapons aboard those probes? Well, as I know, the probe was to be a long-time automatic station on the surface of Phobos. Among the equipment it was to use was a special jumping probe or a hopper, according to Leskov, Izvestia, March 24, 1989. The hopper, which looked a little like a mechanized ladybug, would unfold its spindly legs and literally hop around the moonlet, actually through gigantic strides of about 60 feet. Each time that the hopper would land, it was to use its X-rays to study the soil's chemical composition. It also had a device, penetrometer, to study the moonlet's physical properties and the underlying geological structure. The hopper, according to the Soviets, was also to carry a magnetometer to measure magnetic fields and gravitometer to measure the moonlet's mass. Most likely, this little ingenious ladybug was to carry out some other missions too, and probably was designed to carry some other, maybe more sinister devices or gadgets. We simply do not have enough information, even years after the end of Phobos 2. We already know that a new type of laser weapons was to be used on Phobos. Perhaps this was the reason why it was destroyed before it could complete its mission. Perhaps man or human being is not the master of the solar system as yet. Perhaps those who have left mysterious and deep tracks on Phobos are the true masters. Phobos has mysterious long parallel grooves across a large part of its surface. They are a few hundred meters wide and a few tens of meters deep, and may have been formed by the same impact that caused the crater Stickney, or by an alien intelligence. Our scientists are unable to clearly explain the nature of the grooves. Can they explain how could tiny Phobos generate heat and conventional volcanic activity to account for the presence of numerous craters on its surface? It took the Soviets 10 space probes, none of which carried its program to conclusion, to realize that Mars is very inhospitable. Just 2 Soviet space probes actually made it to the Martian surface. We know about the past failures and recent successes of Americans' Mars exploration program. I am certain that the new space probes will be sent to Mars in the near future, and we'll talk about it. Does it mean that our governments know more than we do and are much more eager to reach Mars and its moonlets? Decide for yourself, but let me provide some data for your thinking process. 10 years went by after the end of the Phobos probes, and another spacecraft, America's Mars Polar Lander, was sent to Mars. The Mars Polar Lander, also known as the Mars Surveyor 9088 lander, was a 290 kilogram robotic spacecraft lander launched by NASA on January 3, 1999, to study the soil and climate of a region near the South Pole on Mars. It formed part of the Mars Surveyor 98 mission. On December 3, 1999, after the descent phase was expected to be complete, the lander just failed to re-establish communication with Earth. The subsequent investigation determined that the most likely cause of the mishap was a premature termination of the engine firing prior to the lander touching the surface, causing it to strike the planet at a high velocity. I just want to add that the 2 Deep Space 2 probes designed to intentionally crash into Mars at 400 miles per hour also vanished without a trace. The Mars microprobe mission, Deep Space 2, was intended to test new technologies and search for water ice in the South Pole soil of Mars. The twin microprobes hitched a ride aboard Mars Polar Lander. Both the lander and the probes were lost. Mars Polar Lander contained a strange device on board, better known as the Light Detection and Ranging, Lidar or Lidar. It was created in the Space Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Science, under the sponsorship of the Russian Space Agency. There was no more USSR, now it's Russian Federation. Now, this was the first Russian instrument to fly on a United States planetary spacecraft. The Lidar instrument was to look for ice and dust clouds. The Lidar system was a laser sounder located on the Mars Polar Lander deck. It was composed of a sensor and electronics assembly. The Lidar transmitter used a gallium aluminum arsenic laser that emits energy in pulses at a constant rate and wavelength. The Lidar had 2 sounding modes, active and acoustic. I have full technical details of the equipment and the laser for those serious researchers who are interested. I translated everything from Russian from open sources. How powerful can such laser device be? It was not, as far as we know, powerful enough to threaten anything substantial on Mars or Phobos. Similar devices are being used by military for the purpose of precise aim or to measure distances accurately. Much more powerful systems are needed to pierce a structure, for example, a metallic hull. And yet, even such a weak laser device is able to penetrate a surface. Once it penetrates a surface, it can interact with the system below, destroy its equilibrium, and damage whatever mechanism lies within it, and consisted of 3 active measurements by each channel. This was an active laser. Russian UFO exchange round table, where news pertaining to ufology had been exchanged, was active about 16 years ago, and I participated in the discussions on a daily basis, or whatever it took. A Russian scientist who was also a participant of the round table actually worked with the creators of the Lidar, but he worked on another project, and we all talked about the mission. He was with the same scientists who had designed all of the devices aboard Soviet spacecraft sent to Venus. Top experts is how he and his colleagues were described. Their invention was original and exquisite. 2 radars, 1 acoustic, 1 laser functioned together. Whatever laser is not capable of operation, wherever it's not capable of operation, like clouds, smoke, or fog, the sound starts its work because it can penetrate further. Where the environment is denser, for example water, only acoustic radar is capable to provide orientation and communication. Laser needs an ideal optically transparent environment. So he talked a lot about what happened and what they invented. Now, the story of the polar lander's failure is well known, although we will probably never learn the true causes of its demise. Mars Global Surveyor was an American robotic spacecraft developed by NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory and launched on November 1996. Mars Global Surveyor was a global mapping mission that examined the entire planet from the ionosphere down through the atmosphere to the surface. It completed its primary mission in January of 2001 and was in its 3rd extended mission phase when, on November 2nd, 2006, the spacecraft failed to respond to messages and commands. I think you've heard something similar in my other descriptions of other spacecraft.